They said, "You know what, Camille? People just come up to me and offer me choices between things I don't like. And like that's supposed to make me want to like them."
Mm.
And I thought about that for a long time. We were in a mental health institution down in Denver. And I thought about what they were saying and just the profound implications that we all want to give choices, right? Hey, do you want the green one or the blue one? And so often we do that because we have an agenda. We're just trying to get behavioral momentum. And I find myself doing it with my kids, almost like it's second nature. And I have to check myself and going, hey, am I giving a choice? Not because I even care what my kid thinks. Am I just trying to get them to engage in choice making right now because it's a tool, because it's utilitarian and I want them to do something for me?
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed that introductory clip. Welcome to session 265 of Behavioral Observations. And as you might guess already, Dr. Camille Kolu joined me again on the podcast. And let's just say that she came back loaded with great insights like these to share with you. If you're not familiar with Camille, she's been on the show before and is one of the predominant voices discussing the impact of trauma and how it interacts with what we do in our field of behavior analysis. In this episode, we discuss our recent paper in Behavior Analysis and Practice. It's called Providing Buffers, Solving Barriers, Value-Driven Policies and Actions that Protect Clients Today and Increase the Chances of Thriving Tomorrow. This article is not necessarily about trauma, but instead it's about practices and repertoires that can protect individuals from the harmful health impacts of adverse childhood experiences. We also discuss Camille's article in Operants Magazine called Understanding Choice, and it's in that context that that earlier clip that I just shared with you came from. I have included both of those articles in the show notes for this episode, so if you want to check them out, just head on over to behavioralobservations.com, and I have as many links as I could find for the stuff that we talked about in this show over there as well. I want to make sure that Camille's work gets supported, so if you like her content and want more training in these areas, she's generously provided listeners with a discount on all her educational materials over at Cusp Emergence University. And again, I have a link to that in the show notes. If you want to go deeper on the topic of buffers and barriers, she has not one but two courses on it, and they both provide ethics and supervision CEUs. If you want to take her other courses in the area of trauma, you can do that as well. But regardless of what you do, be sure to use the promo code SUMMEROFBOP24 to save 24% off at checkout. And that's good for, guess what, the summer of 2024. Camille also created a free 15-minute course called The Buffer Story, Simple, Important Things We Almost Forgot. And she'll be doing a workshop later on this month with Connections Behavior. One way to keep up with Camille's content, which I think is perhaps a one-stop shop for all of these things, is to go to my show notes. I've got a link to sign up for her mailing list, which I did myself. And it's pretty straightforward, and you'll just get periodic updates of what's going on with Camille and other types of trainings and other things that she's involved in. In full disclosure, these are not sponsored products and events. I'm just trying to get the word out about what she's doing. However, I do want to mention the people who actually sponsored this show, and those include our newest sponsor, the New England Center for Children. That's right, I'm beyond thrilled to partner with one of the oldest and well-respected ABA institutions to help them find staff to continue their mission of supporting individuals with autism. Learn about careers at NEC over at necc.org/jobs. We're also brought to you by CEUs from Behavioral Observations. That's right. You can get CEUs while listening to your favorite podcast guests and do so while driving, walking your dog, doing the dishes, etc. Go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more. We're also brought to you by thebehavioraltoolbox.com, which is a new endeavor from Dr. Polly Gavoni, Anika Costa, and myself. We've got a We've got 2 courses that we've gotten great feedback on, Ready, Set, Consult and When Not to FBA, 5 Quick Strategies for Improving Behavior in Classrooms. You can learn more about those over at thebehavioraltoolbox.com. And last but not least, we're brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn more about their CEU offerings, including their 8-hour supervision course, their RBT course, and of course, their very much in-demand webinars that sell out, by the way. So learn more about what they have to offer over at behavioruniversity.com. And don't forget to use the promo code podcast when you check out. That's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Camille Kolu.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Camille Kolu, thank you so much for joining me again on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on. It's so nice to see you again.
Indeed, likewise. And we're just talking about children sleeping, and so we got a window of time here, so I kind of want to get right into it. I've been really looking forward to this interview ever since we scheduled it. I guess where I'd like to start with is it's been a good couple of years. I think you first came on in like 2020 or 2021 or something like this. It's been a long time, and that still is to this day one of the most popular episodes. People comment about it when I meet people at conferences and things like that. And so I'm kind of like, why haven't we done this sooner? All that to say, it's been a little bit. So why don't you just catch us up a little bit about what's going on with you? What have you been doing these days?
Well, that's so nice of you to say, and it's nice to hear. You put those things out there and you're never sure what's going to happen, right? But I've been doing a lot of sourdough bread, a lot of field trips with my kids. They're 5 and almost 3. And the last one we took was to the Noosa factory. Have you had Noosa yogurt?
No.
It's an Australian style, and there is this amazing little factory about maybe 45 minutes from my house, and we got to see them milking the cows. I was just stunned to see all of these ongoing ascent measures for the cows. They have this little kickstand thing where if a cow at any point revokes her consent, she just moves this little piece of equipment under, they stop milking, somebody can adjust it. Many, many little measures like that were set in place, and they took so much pride describing them. It was so cool. It was so cool to see. I was with a BCBAD friend of mine who's also my cousin, and we were just looking at each other over the cows, just amazed. So cool. So been doing a lot of that kind of stuff.
Wow. Well,
Did you mean work?
Well, no, that's cool. I mean, sounds like you found a way to, certainly tie that into the science of behavior for sure. And it's, I'm waiting for the part of the story where you ran up to them and said, let them know, hey, do you know exactly how cool this is to see? But I don't know if that happened or not, or if they called security or who knows. No, I'm just kidding. So you recently published I'll just say it, a brilliant paper that I've shared. It's funny. I found myself reading it, and I was like, and I had to do it the old school way. I printed it out, and I'll put a link to the paper in the show notes. And if other people are going to take it on, I also recommend printing it out, and marking it up, make notes in the margins. I was like taking pictures of sections and sending it to people I know. I'm like, this is really really cool.
Get out of
it's
here.
a
That is
remarkable
so
work
nice.
of scholarship. So the paper is called Providing Buffers, Solving Barriers, Value-Driven Policies and Actions That Protect Clients and Increases the Chances of Thriving Tomorrow. So it's a very lofty title, and you back it up. So again, I don't mean to oversell it here, but I really was very impressed. And so I guess my first question is, we'll get into the content of the paper, and I really love this concept of buffers. But I guess my first question about the paper itself is, what was the the most plain way I can state it was why did you write it? What was the missing piece in the literature that you felt this really large undertaking of scholarship was necessary to fill?
Well, you know what? I should have thought about your first question a little bit more out loud because it had a lot to do with that. So, in the years since I've been on your podcast the first time, Matt, I had another baby and I was actually, this is what led to the paper, is I was struggling. And I thought about whether I should mention this story or not. Sometimes I tell it in person. It's always a little more comfortable to do that because you can see people nodding or turning away or getting turned off. But I think I'll go ahead and share it because some of your listeners could relate possibly. I was struggling so hard. I was going through a little bit of like postpartum anxiety and depression and really hard things. And it was that moment I was nursing my baby and I yelled at my 2-year-old. I yelled at this beautiful little girl who was in there trying to like and for my attention, in both inappropriate and appropriate ways. And I just broke. It was so horrible and so hard to see this. I was looking at myself kind of in a mirror thinking, I am being my worst version of myself right now. I'm literally, this is the worst I've ever been. And I'm doing it to my kids and I'm doing it with my kids. To give you some perspective too, I was having to be up with the baby, about 12 times a night. I had moved into his room at night. Neither of us was sleeping. My poor little girl wasn't getting any attention. I hadn't exercised in probably 10 months to speak of. I wasn't eating because I was trying so hard to just do this, being stuck in parenting at that stage where you think you might not make it till tomorrow. That's how it was. And it was on the advice of a behavior analytic friend of mine to just get that baby a sleep consult. And I actually did. I reached out to somebody and I said, I'm a BCBAD, but I need help. I'm not sleeping. I am going. I hesitate to use all the words that I was thinking about myself at that time. And she gave me a sleep consult and I got him sleeping in a couple of weeks. And the person who did the consult was really familiar with therapies that a young kid's mom would need. She got me a PT consult as well. And I started learning a couple of physical exercises that took away a lot of pain that I had from the birth. So I started exercising. I'm sleeping now. My 2 kids are sleeping. I'm feeling much better. I start eating a lot better because I'm sleeping and feeling a lot better. And at that moment, my relationship with my daughter changed. And so the now 2-year-old and I are hanging out again. We're going to the farmer's market and everything. And around that time, I thought, oh my God, this is what I'm reading about. And so now let's kind of fast forward. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, right? She wrote that beautiful book, The Deepest Well. And I think I've shared this part too, and I'll join these two stories in a second, but I was just struck by the behavioral possibilities in that book. But probably like many of the people listening, and maybe yourself, Matt, I thought, okay, what does this mean? So she lays out this theory and talks about these very research driven areas in which action could prevent the biological changes that take place when we are exposed to inescapable stressors, right? And if action prevents that harm from happening, why aren't we all doing it? We're behavioral. We can engineer the changes in environments that would make these behaviors happen. And so I just decided to do that for myself. And I walked through all the buffers. I put them all back in my own life. My life turned around. I'm feeling great, living my best life. And it's just so striking that all those possibilities are in one human being. Your worst version of yourself, your best version of yourself. And you can do that with someone else in their relationship and align their actions with their values. Because really, I think that's what it's all about. I knew what my values were, but I had such a hard time when I was under all that stress, living out actions that were consistent with that. And it really bothered me. And once I started seeing these concrete changes take place, I thought, okay, somehow I've got to get this story out to the masses. I need to start with my own people, right? Behavior analysts are the people who listen right now. Some parents do. But I really wanted to figure out a way that would address what matters to us as behavior analysts and would address the key problems that they saw with the theory. There are some major barriers to us using this buffers idea. And so that's what I tried to do in the article, is just address that stuff systematically, give us a starting point to see if we take this leap and apply Dr. Burke Harris's work, where might we go?
Hey everyone, I want to take a real quick break here to talk about some upcoming webinars over at behavioruniversity.com. They've got a lot of great stuff, including supervision courses, RBT courses, on-demand trainings, but their webinars are very, very popular, and they do sell out. They've got some great titles coming up, great topics, great presenters. Two of them I'm looking at in particular, Sleep Programming, What You Thought You Knew, and that's from Emily Varon, former guest on the show. That's on July 10th, and then on July 29th, 2024, here's one from Dr. Renee Van Norman called Overcoming Overwhelm, Practical Strategies to Support Well-Being. That looks really cool. And there's many more that are coming up as well. Again, what you're going to want to do is sign up for these right away so you secure your seat, because these things, again, will sell out. And when you're signing up, be sure to use the promo code podcast to save at checkout. You can, again, find all this stuff over at behavioruniversity.com/ABA webinars. All right, that's it. Let's get back to the conversation with Camille. I'm grateful that you did share that story, as personal as it might be, as difficult as it might be, because I can guarantee that there are people who are, who will listen to this, who will certainly relate. Obviously, I can't relate as a mom can, but certainly as a father of three kids, any parent has their moments where they, aren't, let's just put it to use your framing, aren't the best version of themselves. I like that.
Yes.
I'll keep that in mind next time I have to apologize to one of my kids. I'm sorry, I wasn't the best version of myself.
Please do. It's lovely. Lovely to apologize.
That's great. And I was talking with someone else who is like senior vice president in a large healthcare company, and she had felt that her work-life balance was getting skewed in all the wrong directions, and she actually hired a coach, and one of her colleagues that helped her find the coach said, I think the acronym was like, well, what are your red behaviors like? And well, what's that? Rest, exercise, diet. So at least it gets at some of those things. Certainly there's more to that, as you talk about in the paper. So let's get to that. So I want to know what a buffer is, and we can kind of walk through those. But again, I mentioned this a moment ago, and I think it bears repeating, the level of detail that you went into in terms of laying out this whole idea. It looked like the level depth that you would see in like a graduate major area paper or something like that. Did it feel like that? Did it have those grad school vibes, I suppose, when you were writing it? Because the one of the things that I kept doing, it took me a long time to get through the paper, not because of anything having to do with my reading fluency or anything like that, but I kept coming across a reference and like, oh, that's interesting. Next thing you know, I'm flipping all the way back to the end. I'm like, okay, well, who said that? And where was, and then I'll go back and I'll read and like, oh, some other interesting finding that, oh, well, who's, and the paper is, replete with all sorts of really, really interesting references. So I at a certain point, I had to kind of let it go. It's like, okay, stop doing that because you'll never get through the paper. But it just seemed incredibly well sourced. And so I'm just curious what the experience was like pulling all those sources together from all these disparate areas of science too. There's things, of course, from the behavior analytic I guess canon, if you will, and then certainly there's things from neuroscience and everything else in between. So can you talk before we get to the buffers itself? I'd like to hear a little bit about how you marshaled all these resources. What was that process like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for appreciating that piece of it. I do really appreciate your saying so. I think it's really important to make this kind of concept accessible to behavior analysis, right? And I think Dr. Nadine Burke Harris and the people who've been working on this for a long time, like, the people doing the Kaiser studies on ACEs in the 1990s, those kinds of things, right? Those are not new. It's not really new information, but you can see that in our field, there is this hunger, especially among maybe people who are newer to the field. They're excited and attracted to the potential that we have. But you can see this hunger to be preventive, and yet this sort of dearth of resources to direct them to. I love this prevention paper my advisor, Dr. Shala Eli Rosales, wrote a few years ago, the Big Four, how to be preventive by addressing functions before you need to address the function with a behavior of interest, right?
Mhm.
But I wanted to take that idea of how do we be preventive? And I thought, there is no way to tell the story with if we skip this important story about where it came from. This whole idea that there are adverse experiences that everybody faces. And that when you face those things, bad things happen biologically. And it's very consistent with the neuroscience research I had been seeing in the field, the pathways that underlie that idea of learned helplessness or depression. So that needed to be described for a behavior analytic audience, I felt, right before saying, and this is something you can do about it. So kind of started by mapping out the different perspectives that we care about, behavior analysts and our clients, documenting how those relate to buffers. For instance, you kind of see how it starts. We all care about human rights. Nearly every buffer taps into a worldwide health priority right now. And so I put a little bit of that in there. Second, we care about health, client and caregiver health, and each buffer is an area that potentially targets that health in a preventive way. Third, we all care about ethics. We have to. And I've done a lot of personal and clinical work connecting ethics to documenting risks our clients face. And as you do that, you just see this big need to prevent harm, but in a concrete way. And I felt like this story could be told in a way that does connect the science of the brain to the biology of how behavior changes the brain and how that could prevent some of the harm that we're exposed to. And then you think about challenging behavior and all the ways that behavior analysts have already looked at these buffers. And so this one kind of, the reason that I expanded so much on that area, for every single area of a buffer, I try to go through in the paper and document and describe what are the existing contributions of behavior analysts to this topic. And one reason I did that, Matt, is the question I get a lot from people who are interested in this stuff. They say, okay, this sounds really nice, but it's not in my scope of competence, right? It's not in my scope of practice. And I just wanted them to kind of remind themselves, yes, it is. Yes, we have been targeting relationship issues for 40 years. We have great wealth of literature on eating. For almost every buffer, there is a behavior analytics specialty you can work on in graduate school, or maybe apprentice yourself to a wonderful person who studies that and does that almost for a living. And so I have to credit my editor on that paper, Dr. John Guercio, who suggested that I group that into chunks and really talk about that behavioral literature a little bit more. And I hadn't encountered a lot of his work before, and I was so excited to kind of look up some of the neat stuff he's done because he worked on stimulus avoidance assessments before and how that relates to relaxation training. And I just think that's such a big missing area. We address preferences all the time, but we very rarely look systematically at what's wrong in someone's history that contributed to why they're not able to relax or whatever. So I was really grateful to him for showing me some of that stuff. And once he made the suggestion editorially, the rest of the paper kind of came together. I scaled back on some of the other stuff I had put in there and just decided to focus on these buffers as a package. And then what it would take policy wise, what I have seen companies do when they actually were able to get this in the behavior plan, work on it with caregivers, start building that community connection. So those were the things that I kind of bulleted out as I was thinking, what is this paper going to look like? And am I going to have to make 4 papers to just address it? Ultimately, maybe the answer is I should have, but I decided to put it all together. So if somebody wants to read this, they can. And it's in a policy issue of behavior analysis in practice. So I felt like you had to go there with policy and tie it all together.
Well, I'm glad you got connected with John. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. I've had a chance to hang out with him at conferences before, and he's just incredibly smart and very, very can go very deep into literature, as I'm sure you've come to learn. So let's, there's probably people in the audience like, all right, that's great. Just get to the buffers. I want to learn. So what are these buffers? And if you can give us maybe a thumbnail sketch of each one as you go through them.
Okay. Yeah. You know what? I'll start with exercise because John actually turned me on to this wonderful book called Spark, which really connects the science of exercise and how it changes the brain, right? So I've been kind of collecting these ideas for a while, and I love making lists of all the neat books and resources that the layperson could just find and amass to understand these buffers. But basically, kind of as Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris put it, a buffer is an area in which if we used focused behavioral action in that area contributes, as it's shown in the medical literature, okay? It contributes to preventing some of the biological harms that are caused by unavoidable, unpredictable stressors and aversive stimuli. And so she describes these 6 different areas. I'm going to say them not exactly in an acronym, but I'll do it in sort of a sing-songy way because I find this helps listeners to remember them. Relationship, nutrition, exercise, sleep, mental health, and stress relief. Relationship, nutrition, exercise, sleep, mental health, and stress relief. And so all of these areas are places that we might target in the behavior plan if something is going wrong, but they're not always addressed preventively as a group. And these are areas in which if you use specific action, so for example, you've got a kid who's using a lot of unsafe behaviors, and you don't look at these areas until there's a problem with one of them, you often find that, oh, okay, maybe I should have preventatively looked to see, was he eating healthfully? Was he sleeping at night? Was he getting any physical activity? Does his caregiver know how to really help him with stress relief? How's his mental health, right? And so if you look at all those things preventively, we do a lot of wonderful work in terms of preventing a lot of those downstream biological harms. Now, we haven't mentioned this yet, but the evidence shows that those biological harms are dose dependent. And so the more adverse experiences we go through, the worse those outcomes are medically for us. Kids get diseases that adults get. You have early onset of things. You have more inflammation. And in the paper, I do give a lot of references and a table that goes over a few of those. And so it's not in my scope, and it's certainly not in my training to talk about the medical impacts. However, we are obligated ethically to rule out or to document the impacts of medical impacts on behaviors that we're treating, right? And so it does make sense ethically for us to look at these 6 areas in just a preventive or a proactive, I should say, a proactive way.
Hey everyone, are you looking for a meaningful career in autism education and behavior analysis? Then look no further than the New England Center for Children. The New England Center for Children is the country's leading autism school and research center. And for 50 years, they've helped transform the lives of children with autism. And they're currently hiring teachers and BCBAs in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. NEC offers the industry's most competitive pay, professional development, and benefits package, including free graduate school. That's right, free graduate school. They also provide ongoing training for their staff, from annual refreshers to continuing education units for their professional certifications and licenses. Another great thing about NEC is that learning extends beyond their classroom walls. That's because the New England Center operates 14 residential homes and consults with more than 60 public school districts. NEC also operates a school in Abu Dhabi and clinics throughout the Middle East, and as such, teachers and staff have opportunities to work abroad. If this all sounds good to you, and you'd like to join the more than 500 teachers and BCBAs in making a difference in the lives of children with autism, go to necc.org/jobs to learn more. That's nec.org/jobs. So that's a good point about it. these stressors impacting people, physiologically earlier on in life. I my day job is school consultation, and I have the opportunity to support a lot of communities, and a lot of the communities I work in are very disadvantaged communities. So when you meet with like IEP teams and other kind of stakeholders a lot, particularly those families who have been through a lot, we'll just kind of, leave it at that to fill, people could fill in the blanks. Sometimes there is people might look advanced like physiologically in their age because they've had, a difficult path to follow in life. So I totally can see that. I take your point that some of these buffers are, behavior analysts might have some confidence in at least examining some of these buffers. I think things like sleep and nutrition and exercise are at least measurable, countable things. I'm curious, though, with some of the fuzzier ones, if you will, or at least I'm calling them that, things like, nurturing relationships, so, people might say, well, what does that mean to have a nurturing relationship? Mental health, stress reduction, those things are a little more difficult to quantify, or at least that's my, I guess, claim, if you will. Curious what your response might be to someone who might be like, yeah, that sounds great. And that sounds very, very important. And I'm struggling to kind of operationalize that in a way that I can make a difference or move the needle. So how would you respond to someone who might have that apprehension?
I love that question. And it's so true, right? I mean, on the one hand, you can look at one of the fuzzy buffers, and man, I'm going to credit you. I'm going to call them the 3 hard buffers and the 3 fuzzy buffers, because that makes so much sense to me visually as I picture them. It is warm and fuzzy to address relationships and mental health and stress relief. So, on the one hand, I do describe some of the literature in terms of relationship and how we have targeted that in behavior analysis in the past, right? But if you think about it, okay, there is a lot of good work on improving social skills and caregiver relationships with their children, and the kind of work that we do in parent training, for example, and all the peer studies and that lovely stuff, and rapport. But thinking about rapport, that sort of highlights the problem, because haven't we often been so transactional with how we teach rapport and why we teach rapport and why we use rapport, and so utilitarian, right? I'm going to put just a few names for the things we do in the nurturing relationship. I'll talk about those a little bit in terms of what we have in the paper, but then I want to go further and give you sort of a way to do this in terms of the buffers themselves. I think the first idea from the paper, and something I want everybody to always do, is try not to hurt. It sounds really obvious, but we have to honor the relationships that already exist for our client or for our caregivers or for our staff. And so often we're accidentally, inadvertently creating this environment that's almost making it harder for them to interact with the ones that they loved, almost making work seem so attractive that they're doing less of what they love and more work, and, just kind of taking away from the one thing maybe we should be fostering or helping to flourish. And so that's important, right? Is be sure that nothing we do interferes with the relationships that others value, at least if they're nurturing relationships. Another piece that will be familiar to people with the ethics code is just clarifying roles and boundaries and using really clear communication about what your relationship is, the nature of that. And then this idea that Rajaram et al. Comes up with and talks about establishing ourselves as safety signals, maybe reestablishing ourselves as safety signals. Well, that's an important thing that a lot of caregivers need help with. They need to know, how do I repair my relationship with my child who I maybe gave a lot of support on that I thought was supportive, and they didn't take it that way, right? With this kind of tidal wave of understanding that some of the practices we've been using have been experienced differently as we intended. So maybe they've been harmful or hurtful on the receiving end. How do we reestablish ourselves as safe people? And so I think that all is really important, right? But I'm going to switch from the relationship buffer for a second and tell you about how I'm thinking about the mental health buffer, because I truly think you can kind of use one as a lens to approach the other. So, thinking about the mental health buffer in my paper and in a lot of the work, it's very reductive. We're thinking about mental health as the absence of mental illness. I would venture to say most of us, in behavior analysis at least, we're not positive psychologists, right? We're not thinking about the optimism literature for what mental health is. We're all thinking, okay, well, I want to do preventive visits with his mental health provider or their therapist, and they're on the schedule. Great, mental health is taken care of. But that's not it, right? That's just a teeny tiny part of it. And it's not even necessarily true. I think we have to open up and give people permission to exist in this place where it's okay to have a mental illness and also to be experiencing wonderful aspects of mental health. These things can both be true, right? Many of us are living with anxiety or something like that. Many of us have definitions or labels applied to us, and maybe we have an aspect of suffering that we're going through. But if you have also layer on what mental health is to the person, okay, so it's not just the absence of something negative, quote unquote. What is it? And so if you look at that literature, and there's some really neat little studies that are more recent, it's PERMA. It's this acronym. P is for positive emotions, engagement in things you love, relationships, finding meaning, and experiencing achievement. And so those 5 things. Now, for a second, use that idea, right, about defining what does it look like if my client is actually healthy mentally. Can you apply that to relationship, to the nurturing relationship? I think you can. So what would it be like if I was doing and saying and thinking and exploring and tasting and hearing the things with my partner that make us both experience positive emotion, right? Or that make us feel engaged, or that allow us to experience meaning together or shared achievement, right? And so I love that idea. And this is sort of an innovation on the model that I presented in the paper, because you do a lot of work for 3 or 4 years, and then you start doing more, and you can't pack it all into something you already submitted. So this is sort of where it's going now, right? Is huge expansion in the mental health buffer and the stress relief buffer. But yeah, I wonder if that explanation, Matt, does that kind of help you see this as more concrete, as things we could do?
It does. I guess I have a couple thoughts. One is I like the notion of helping people expand their repertoires to find more enjoyable things to do in their lives, certainly. And I also like the idea of, I don't know if this is an apt metaphor, but if the whatever aspect of the suffering that those examples that you described is if we were to somehow measure that, and it's part of the pie chart of one's life, it sounds like the goal then is to expand the pie. We might not reduce the size of the slice that is the suffering, but rather increase the size of the pie, so proportionally the suffering is less representative of the whole. Yeah, that's really interesting, and certainly teaching new repertoires is within the purview of behavior analysis, I hope. So this is very aspirational, I suppose, and I think that's one of the things that makes this such an interesting concept to wrestle with, just from a philosophical standpoint. This is it's certainly a new perspective.
Regardless of your title, if you are a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results, you are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
I want to come back. You mentioned it really briefly, the whole notion of learned helplessness. You devoted I think a good couple of paragraphs to that topic. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, if you give people a reminder of obviously there's been 50 years of research on it, certainly. I was going to say, can you give a brief description of it, of something that's been studied for decades and decades? But if you can give kind of like a thumbnail sketch of learned helplessness, and then tell us why you felt that was important to include in the paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mind that it's aspirational. I realize that is a problem. It means this is not something that's, on the one hand, it's not something that's easily downloaded and regurgitated and, done with everybody. On the other hand, it is, because wherever you start, you want to try to apply some of the buffers with your client. You want to look through their behavior plan and see, hey, are these things in there? Are we addressing them preventively? That's doable for everybody, right? The other stuff, meaning, achievement, great nurturing relationships, yeah, that may take a little while. That's okay. Do you want to expand your repertoires or don't you? Expand boundaries of competence, right? So yes, it is expansive and it's going to require a little bit of work. The third fuzzy buffer, if you will, was stress relief. And people generally talk about that one as mindfulness, ways to bring your stress under control, maybe doing yoga. But I want to talk about it, and I wanted to in the paper too. This is why I brought it up in the paper. I wanted to talk about it in terms of the learned helplessness research, because I think that research gives us two very specific, very doable, very behavioral things that will do the stress buffer for us. Sometimes I call this the behavioral buffer, in fact, because I think it's the one most amenable to making the kind of changes in behavior plans that make a huge difference for my clients. And I can give you an example in a minute. But okay, the basic idea of learned helplessness is basically we're exposed to uncontrollable stress. And when we do, we shut down and we learn to be helpless. So that idea has its roots in experiments that were done, like you mentioned, 50 years ago. Interestingly, I live, and I can kind of see Boulder, Colorado from here. I live very close, and I haven't met him in person. But I live very close to the person who did those experiments, Dr. Steve Meyer. He's over there at one of the universities in Boulder. But he worked with Marty Seligman, who did a lot of the work in psychology that led to optimism and positive psychology movement, which is not as warm and fuzzy as it sounds. And so the new neuroscience since that time has really focused on elucidating what are those pathways that underlie learned helplessness, and what Seligman and Meyer have just published about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6, maybe more years ago now, in their retrospective of learned helplessness 50 years later, right? Mm-hmm. They found that they got it wrong, right? It wasn't that we learn helplessness, it's that that's the default if we're not learning to control our environment. If we are, then you can't call it an uncontrollable stressor anymore, can you? And so the thing is, we're not learning to be helpless. That's just the default pattern taking place. That helpless pattern, that laying down and not moving, is accomplished by this pathway that ends up causing all of this biological damage, right? So if you wanted to prevent all this biological damage that is a result of facing uncontrollable stressors, what you have to do instead, and I'm going to use some colloquial terms, what you have to do instead is detect or predict and control the stressor. But I think that's very easily discussed in terms of behavior analysis. We could talk about it in terms of making an observing response, right? Noting the aspects of the stimulus complex. Is it salient? Is there a CS related to it that you end up seeing in the environment, right? What's the discriminative stimulus? Whatever it is about the stressor that you can detect, you make an observing response to that, and then the organism has to make some kind of differential response to the stressor. Maybe it's some kind of behavioral control. Maybe they can turn down the stressor a little bit, or maybe ask for help in the middle of it, or use a skill that they've practiced earlier to calm themselves down or to keep breathing during the stressor. The point is, what we know now is that when we face a stressor, if we exert behavioral control about it or over the situation, we don't have learned helplessness happen. And that pathway is totally different now. Those biological changes don't happen now. And so the stress relief buffer is so important because it literally is a way to control stressors. It literally controls the outcome of the stress as well on the body. But it's also very, very doable behaviorally. So when I have a behavior plan, I often give this example that's a real example and replicate it across a ton of my clients. Every single time I have a client, we do this. Figure out, what are they stressed about? What hard, difficult, unpredictable things are going to happen next week? How are we going to predict them? How are we going to cue the caregivers to be ready to pre-cue and prime the kind of skills that will be helpful, right? And how are we going to reinforce those things early in the repertoire to make sure that she's fluent and ready when she needs them? And so, again, you could think about it in terms of those cognitive terms, prediction and control, but it's also very behavioral.
I'm glad you took the page. I know page space is a commodity in journals, so I'm glad that that you guys were able to fit that in. But between your interactions with John about that, the paper goes on and kind of frames this up in what you're calling the butterflies tool. So I want to give you an opportunity to describe what you mean by that. And I know you have some trainings on this and so forth as well, I believe. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about the tool itself and how that fits in the context of, I guess, this very broad foundation that you just laid.
Okay. I think one of the great questions I get from people, and I always make a tool in response to a set of really great questions, because I know that I won't be there to answer the question after the workshop or after the parent training. And so I want to operationalize the question with its answer in such a way that the person could take it and use it when I'm not there. And so this is kind of an attempt to do that. So one of the great questions that always comes up is, not only is this in my scope of competence, but how does this stuff relate to our ABA dimensions, right? The dimensions of ABA. And I know that there's a little controversy there as ever, and that's fine. And that not all great work, and certainly not all new research or new ideas, will have a relationship to every single one that will be clear cut and answerable from the very beginning. But the paper does try to address a couple of things really clearly, like the applied significance of it, the relationship to its conceptual foundation, it being rooted firmly there in the science. Well, the idea of active nurturance, the idea of operationalizing this idea of the buffers, it comes down to making sure we can do this in a way that's conceptually systematic. And when we're implementing the buffers, I find that there's usually a great set of reasons that the person is not already there. They're facing barriers. They're facing these huge barriers, right? In my case, a lot of the barriers were solved when I started looking at them systematically. But I think that's my lens of knowing, okay, this is how I'm going to solve my problem. And I started trying to look for caregivers and for clients. What buffers are they able to do, and why aren't they able to do them? When I did that, I kind of got these groups of different barriers. Like, wow, they have all the resources they need, but they have no social support. Or, they have no money to do these kinds of things. They can't take a bus to get to that part of town where the wonderful, nurturing, healthy food is available for them to pick up for free. And I'm on groups all the time where somebody is asking for help with something that might seem so trivial, and you think, wow, that is a barrier for them. If everybody knew about the other barriers people face, we could come together and solve some of these barriers, right? So that's what I'm trying to do, is just the tool, the butterflies tool. Butterflies is an acronym I'll share. And we're just trying to target them in conceptually systematic ways that are pragmatic for us. So I think before Stokes and Bayer, and this is maybe a good parallel, we behavior analysts, our community, we might not have all thought about the need to systematically prompt towards generalization, right? Some of us were doing it, some of us weren't. Sometimes we had great means of doing it. Sometimes we train and hope. And I didn't want that to happen with buffers, and especially with the barriers people face. If we take, and I'm going to quote, very loosely quote, Denisha Jingles, we just had her at the Bay Path Trauma Conference. And I don't have the quote in front of me, so please forgive me, Denisha, if this is sort of butchering it a little bit. But she talked about how when we take a colorblind approach, and I think she's actually quoting from another article too, when we take a colorblind approach, we might be missing some of the big individual differences that make people, so different. We can't take a colorblind approach necessarily with things like buffers. If somebody in your company is disproportionately affected by a marked difference in how they can access the buffers, don't you think we need to kind of level out that playing field? Don't you think we need to make sure we all have access to solving these buffers? And so the tool is trying to help people see that all of these different barriers folks face, we should probably look at each one of them and make sure that we're not missing something huge. So butterflies, it stands for looking at the person's behavior plan to see if there's intersections there. Are there triggers and difficulties? That's what the T stands for. Does the person have the intact repertoires and relationship issues they need? Are there issues with their fluency and their behavior stream? L is for learning new skills, and S is for scanning periodically. Now, when I do a scan on myself and I look at the buffers and I look at barriers, it's not the same 2 months later. It's really different. I find that, now I'm really focused on exercise and nutrition, but you know what? My primary relationship with my partner is really suffering now, and it wasn't 2 months ago. What do I need to do to get that kind of back into alignment? And so just looking at something systematically over maybe every 3 months, I kind of look at this with my own self. It reminds us that these are always important, and we might need to kind of restructure things. When things change, we might need to tap into one of those buffers or solve a new barrier that happened now. And so the butterflies, that little tool, it's published in there in the article. There's a set of commentary that kind of goes through each section, gives some ideas about how to use it, how it can prompt a behavior analyst to meaningful conversations with our clients and their caregivers and maybe the staff at an organization that's going to help them be a little bit more systematic in how we address this. Because again, kind of like generalization, if we just hope this is done, it's not anyone else's job. It may sound simple, it is, but it's not that easy. And yet it can be done in a systematic way.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. I want to switch gears real quick and talk about another piece that you drew my attention to, your recent article in Operants And I did not get a chance to give you confession time here. I didn't get a chance to read it as closely as I would have liked before we met today. But I have to say, I was struck by a couple of quotes here, and I'd like to get your reactions to the reactions to your own writing, I guess, or at least some some of the nuance that went, or some of the thinking that went behind why you chose to phrase things this way. Because I just thought these quotes were just fantastic. So, in one section of the paper, you write, offering choices might be a staple in the repertoire of a behavior technician excited to incorporate choices for all clients. But for some clients, experiencing a vocal choice from an RBT might constitute a surrogate condition motivating operation, in the presence of which rapid onset of escape behavior is highly likely. Choices can be employed strategically to reduce behavior labeled as quote unquote challenging, yet could also be experienced as punishing or manipulative. When I read that, I was just like, whoa, that's deep. So if you can maybe elaborate on that, I'd love to hear your thinking behind how the idea behind this really remarkable quote.
Sure. Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind. I should first say just a big thank you, because Operants Magazine is so cool. And I do have the issue or my article on it up on my website, but it's not an issue you can see unless you subscribe to Operants Magazine, which is part of the B.F. Skinner Foundation. And it's so neat. And Alice Schillingsberger?
Schillingsberg, yep.
Schillingsberg, thank you. Yeah. She edited this issue on control and choice. And there are so many cool pieces in there. I mean, the author list is it's so humbling to be on that same page with that table of contents. It really is. And at the same time, I was really humbled to be asked by Andy Littall and Eddie Fernandez, who are the guest editors of that issue, and both have really cool things to say. I always love Andy's work on schedules, and Eddie and I are friends from grad school, and he's doing amazing work with animals, So it was just really neat to be part of that experience. Now, the quote that you mentioned, that's funny because it was almost said to me in verbatim, and I translated it by somebody who had autism a long time ago. They said, "You know what, Camille? People just come up to me and offer me choices between things I don't like, and like that's supposed to make me want to like them." And I thought about that for a long time. We were in a mental health institution down in Denver, and I thought about what they were saying and just the profound implications that we all want to give choices, right? Hey, do you want the green one or the blue one? And so often we do that because we have an agenda. We're just trying to get behavioral momentum. And I find myself doing it with my kids, almost like it's second nature. And I have to check myself and going, hey, am I giving a choice? Not because I even care what my kid thinks. Am I just trying to get them to engage in choice making right now because it's a tool, because it's utilitarian, and I want them to do something for me?
I've sometimes thought about that as the illusion of choice.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Do you want to do this worksheet with a pencil or a pen? Like, I really, I want the worksheet done, though. That's the bottom line,
Yes. Like, I have an agenda, and I know behaviorally of several ways to manipulate you, honestly, to manipulate you into making a quote unquote choice that's going to be used to get you moving on the path I want. And truly, there are some great articles surrounding mine. Like Joe Lang has a good one. Ditu Rajamoran has one in there too about sort of these issues, right? But yeah, I think that's what it's all about, is that you don't know the history that someone has with respect to the options. Sure, we know that. But you don't know the history they have with respect to the procedure of choice making too. The conditions under which they've been exposed to choices, or maybe not ever asked what they really think, just given choices between two options that aren't even appetitive to them. Or maybe one of the options has a history with respect to punishment, and you may never know why they don't choose that wonderful thing you think is amazing. So yeah, there's so many neat things that I got to explore and remember in that paper. And I kind of tried to do it from that parent perspective, and it was fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it came from an interaction you had with someone who experienced that makes it all the more salient here. And then and this, I guess, a segue into like the last couple of questions I have for you here, and maybe it's just because I'm going to be 50 in a few months, I find myself in these kind of old man yelling at clouds moments. But you have this quote here that I when I read, like, she must be writing that just for me. It says a procedure contraindicated for one client may be used ethically to produce socially valid outcomes for another. And I just thought that was a really powerful statement, especially in the context of where we are right now, where so much of what you see, particularly in social media, there's all these, for lack of a better term, arbitrary rules that are, people are putting in these nice, they're writing them in these nice little Canva squares, and it's like, don't do this, do that. And I think the degree to which they're more rigid and less, I guess, stated with nuance, the more they I guess irritate me, if you will. And so I found this quote, quite validating. So, and again, I don't know if there's any more commentary that you want to throw at that, but I just wanted to share my, how that struck me. So I thought that was very, very good.
I mean, I like Canva. I just discovered it. I'm one of those really old to Instagram people who got on it to try to chat with people, try to connect with my audience and in a new way, because I am so, quote, old in the field. I'm pushing 46 here, and I got in trouble my first day or so on Instagram. Do you know this story?
No.
I make sourdough, and I thought I'm gonna hashtag myself the sourdough, right? Because I'm a doctor and I make sourdough. It's hilarious. And about an
Sounds
hour
good to me.
later, my babysitter's in there. We only had her like once, so this is just serendipity that she was even there. She's 17, and I came in running and crying, and I said, Kira, I accidentally hashtagged this. Apparently it's a marijuana strain, sourdough. I thought it was cool. Oh no. And how do I remove this hashtag? I am in trouble. Fortunately, I had like one follower. I'm sure they didn't care. She told me how to remove the hashtag. I was way more careful.
Oh boy, that's funny.
Yeah, Instagram. It's been a whole thing. And
your
sometimes
Instagram
I do.
feed is very, very. By the way, that is very, very cool. I've enjoyed following it, and you do post a lot of really nice stuff. And I am a Canva user. I have a Canva Pro account, so I'm not.
Nice.
I'm not opposed to Canva per se. I just see all these like, kind of like should statements that,
Totally.
or thou shalt this, that, and the other thing. And
yes, and I get that.
I've got a little bit of, a oppositional streak in me. So I don't know, for some reason, it just, because when someone says don't do that, it gets that under what conditions, framing that we were talking about before we hit the record button, about like, well, I bet I could think of a condition under which, the whatever prohibited thing that people are talking about today might possibly be helpful for an individual. But I don't want to belabor the point. I guess the last thing.
No, that's okay. I think the point about contraindicated procedures, that's a point I've been trying to make for years, right? Because I'm so often asked what procedures are contraindicated for trauma. And it came up in that choice and control article because the answer is it's an individualized question, just like anything. It depends. It depends on what the values are, what the client needs, the individual history with respect to the alternatives you're offering. It will always, it will almost always depend. What's contraindicated, again, for one person might be ethical and appropriate and assent-based and important to someone else.
Indeed. And, and I should just, I guess, step back for a moment and just acknowledge that, these concerns are coming from largely from the intention to reduce harm. So I'm not saying that the motives, I'm not questioning the motives or anything like that. So I should just make sure I state that for clarity purposes. So, but I guess the final question I have here is kind of related on the same theme, is that, widening the conversation about trauma, in just a few short years, trauma has become kind of like a household term, not just in behavior analysis, but in the culture, I think also. But within behavior analysis, many providers are, using these terms in their marketing materials, and, as well as other types of ABA descriptors. And every once in a while, kind of describe this as hyphenated ABA, And I think I sent you I got, how as a BCBA, we all get like 100 job, offers a week through the, the automated system. One came through looking for an assent and trauma assumed BCBA. That's the descriptor. Now, I understand that this is, again, it's probably coming from a very, very good place. So, and I'm not trying to dunk on anyone in particular. And I'm sure the person who wrote the job advertisement has the best of intentions. But I sometimes worry about these sorts of a balkanization, if you will, of the field, or tribalism, if you will, and like, these people are incorporating these terms into their marketing materials. They put it on their websites and things like that. I don't know. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on these. I guess from my perspective, I worry that this could be confusing to consumers, certainly, and then at the same time, this not much I don't believe to be in the way of standardization of what is an assent and trauma assumed BCBA, or any other type of, so such and such affirming BCBA, what does that mean? And I think that's, you've been working in this, kind of trauma area. And I think you're probably the go-to resource or expert, along with probably, the aforementioned Dr. Rajaraman in the field. But I'm just curious what your broader perspective is on how these terms have developed such a prominence in how we talk about these things, how we market ourselves, how we put what our forward facing, I guess, media are to the broader public.
Well, there's great harm in the one sense of attaching some word to an approach anytime you do it, because that then opens up people who don't have the approach to call themselves the word and to get taken in. There's some repackaging going on for people who want to be more accepted, so they can rebrand themselves in this way. And all of a sudden, they get a new clientele, right? Or new followers. And I think that's very dangerous. But that also, it's sort of a feature, not a bug necessarily. It's just part of, I think, language. I think it's part of how we language about all these terms. The reason I called it TIBA originally, like 12 years ago, when I started blogging about this, was to connect with people who knew about trauma and knew that the behavior analysis they received before didn't feel good to them. And I wanted them to know that I was going to listen to their individualized needs. And I tried to make T-charts of what you might have experienced with behavior analysis, and how, if it were nuanced and appreciative of their individualized histories, what it would really look like. And so, as you know, and I hope a lot of listeners know, that doesn't make it trauma informed or make it any different or make it not behavior analytic. It just is a new name that people could see and say, oh, okay, she's going to listen. And so on the one hand, I feel great responsibility for putting that idea out there. I don't think I'd seen it in writing before I thought about it. And it's a reason, too, that several years later I wrote why trauma-informed behavior analysis is redundant and why I do it and say it anyway. Right.
I was going to mention that. It's like one of your probably most well-known blog posts. Yeah, for sure.
Could be. So I do think there's some harm. There's some good. It's always worth exploring what the practitioners really do and asking them questions. So what would you do with this problem? How do you document behavioral histories in a learner? What tools do you use, and how do you differentiate your practices? That means so much more than what they call themselves. I will say, and I really hope that people listening have noticed, I didn't use the word trauma this whole time. I didn't use it until your question.
Right.
And it's very specific and on purpose of me. I want people to know this idea of using preventive behavior analytic techniques, maybe using a buffers and barriers approach to prevention, is not about trauma. It doesn't matter if your client has a diagnosis. It doesn't matter if you can define trauma or not. It doesn't matter if you've been trained to diagnose trauma. It really doesn't matter. And that's because this whole approach is predicated not on trauma, right? Not on a diagnosis or anything like that, just on biology, just on this idea that when we're exposed to uncontrollable stressors, challenging things happen in our biology. These things are lifelong, they're dose respondent, and there's something we can do about it with the behavioral environments that we engineer every day.
I think that's the podcast right there in a nutshell. Camille, if people want to learn more about you, your trainings, everything, where should they go?
Well, as always, there's two pieces. There's cuspemergence.com, which is a blog. Now, I do have a resources tab on that blog, and you can get a lot of the articles that I've referenced today, tools, different ideas. But if you're interested in CEUs or training, that's the cuspemergenceuniversity.com. One thing I've challenged myself to do recently, Matt, is to try to make a consumable, my mom or dad, my grandma can listen to this and understand it version of whatever I'm doing now. And so if you go to Cusp Emergence University, there is a little course called the Buffer Story. Maybe something like lessons we knew and almost forgot or something like that, the Buffer Story. And it's free. So it's like a little 15-minute video where you can also get all the resources free after you watch that video. So I usually try to also say you can sign up to get emails. There's like a little tab on the Cusp Emergence University blog if you want to be on that list for when we have new courses. Because this whole idea, you know, as I mentioned a couple times, it's simple, it's not easy, but it's very, very helpful. And as we do it with companies, there's this whole neat systems approach idea that comes in. As we do it with caregivers, there's a different set of things we need to know, right? There's this whole idea of how it intersects with the ABA dimension. And so each of those is coming with its own little explanation and like an hour-long training that you can use to learn more. And how does it apply to behavior plans? You know, this age of client, that age of client. I will say for a second, almost nobody is that familiar with dementia work or the great stuff we could do in elder care. And these buffers are just as applicable, if not more so, in that time of life too. And they're applied a little differently. And often we end up working on, you know, for example, in mental health, it's not so much that we're doing things, but we're reinforcing the memories folks have and the wonderful relationships they remember. And we kind of apply it differently, but in a way that seems valuable to those folks. So there's all different kinds of trainings on the websites I mentioned. You could also follow me for more gaffes on Instagram. It's just at Cusp Emergence there.
Awesome. We'll have the links to all of those in the show notes of this episode. And if you're not signed up for the Behavioral Observations mailing list, I send out the show notes to every episode. So you can go to the website, sign up for the mailing list that is 100% non-spammy. Nice. And I send all the show notes to every episode out to all the subscribers. So you don't have to go to the website. So, and you can learn all about Cusp Emergence as while you're at it. Camille, it's been great fun. I learned so much when you come on the show. Thanks for visiting with us again.
Thank you so much for having me and valuing this information. I so appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.